going to introduce our speaker tonight and also tell you about some upcoming webinars that we have tonight. So thank you for joining us for our session on centering Native stories in Florida history. We have several Florida participants here today, so this is certainly an important webinar, and we are so grateful that Alejandra could be here with us tonight from the University of California, Riverside. So thank you for being here. Just a reminder of some other webinars we have coming up next week on the 16th, also at 7:30 Eastern. We have Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, the American Expansion, and the Political Plunder in North America. So that is next week on the 16th. On February 22nd, we have Native Nations and the U.S. Supreme Court with Greg Ablavsky from Stanford Law. And then coming up in March, we have author Stacy Schiff, who is going to be here with us to talk about her new book, Samuel Adams Revolutionary. So we hope you can join us for those sessions. You can register for those on our website at ncheteach.org. So without further ado, I am going to hand over the mic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to share my screen so we can get moving and have this. What I'm hoping is a little bit of a conversation, even though I'm going to be doing a bulk of the talking about centering Native stories in Florida. Just a very quick introduction of who I am. Like I've already been introduced, my name is Alejandra. I'm a professor at UC Riverside in California. I am currently in my office in Riverside, so I'm currently in Coahuila, Tongva, Serrano, and Luis Tenio land. And the practice of sort of acknowledging the land we're in for me is not just perfunctory, it's not something I do to get it out of the way, but it's to be very conscious that in fact we are on Indigenous land, and to have that in our heads as we begin to engage with the past. And a past that for many of us is something we know is very much a Native and inhabited past, but for some of us, we're coming to it in a new way. So I heard a little bit about your conversation about the article I encouraged you all to read. So perhaps, I know it's late and I'm asking you to do work after teaching, but perhaps if you wouldn't mind sort of putting a very quick 1 or 2 sentence impressions in the chat about this article, about your reaction to thinking about these stories of Indigenous people in early Florida, in a place you live in and you teach in. So I'll see if anyone wants to sort of write a reaction about the article itself. If anyone was surprised or shocked by it. Waiting to see. Erin, yes, your comments are thinking about how much we can try to glean about a woman's story and her own experiences therein. Really different perspective. Yeah, Kelly, thank you so much about sort of thinking about different pieces and how to piece the stories together. Thank you so much. So I think that's part of what I'm going to try to do today. Oh, it gave you lots of questions. Yay! I'm so excited by your comments, all about the misunderstandings. And Jamila Taylor says, I want to know more about Madalena. Trust me, I desperately do as well. So I think for today, and as you're all teachers and you're thinking both about your own sort of instruction and edification and how you can, become better scholars so you can teach your students better. I'm going to try to do a little bit of that, but also a little bit of helping you think about how we can think about history. So as a historian, for me, what's really exciting about the past is not just the stories we can tell and uncover, but giving our students the tools to then interrogate the past. And so what I'm going to try to highlight here is, how do we do that? How do we access the past to tell us stories of Indigenous people? And how do we teach our students, again, to think about those things? And that's going to be sort of the bulk of my talk. Like you can see here, I'm going to move very quickly through a chronology of Florida, more than anything to situate ourselves. And then I'm going to talk about these stories, these archival stories of Indigenous people. And first, more than anything, is to communicate them with you, just like the Madalena story, to give you a sense of, that these people are there, that they had really complex, fascinating lives, but also to get you to think about how can we poke our students in and encourage them to think about these kind of stories. All right, so the very briefest history of Florida history that I can possibly give in like 3 minutes or less. right? But just to get our minds all together. And I'm going to be doing some very purposeful things in the way I situate Florida history. And then I'm going to sort of explain why I did them. So just very quickly to wrap our heads, the Spanish established, they had been in the region before the 1560s, but they're able to finally establish their first permanent hold in what's now St. Augustine, San Agustin in 1565. The population is very small, Spanish people who get there, and the very sort of largest efforts, right, to bring people into the area are by missionaries and by first Jesuits and then Franciscans. So you have a very small sort of push out into Florida. Florida is established and maintained by the Spanish Empire, most of anything as an outpost in theory, right? In theory, it's not made just to be a missionary activity, but to be an outpost to protect the Spanish fleets that are sailing out of the Caribbean following that Atlantic current out. But, you know, it's not a great outpost. It really is not. It gets attacked by Sir Francis Drake and burned to the ground in 1685. This is what this image is like. And actually, this is a great image to show your students about the pirate attack. First of all, I think pirates are very fantastic things to teach our students. They're fun. They have sort of an idea what there is. But this image is a sort of stop motion animation image where it shows the fleet at the bottom in stage 1, in stage 2, and in stage 3 attacking St. Augustine. And if you could zoom into the very details of the image, you see the Spaniards like running away as Drake attacks. After sort of the destruction at Drake and the Spanish decide to seriously begin building a fort, it takes a very long time for St. Augustine to actually be built out of stone. If you think about Florida, there's not a lot of stone in Florida, so they have to import and think about how to make that coquina fortification. From the 1650s to the 1600s to the 1650s, the majority of Spanish activity in this region is going to be missions. You're going to see an expansion of Florida Franciscan missions, but they're still going to be relatively small. We're talking at the height of mission activity comes in 1655, and you have about 70 Franciscan friars in about 40 mission sites, and they're claiming they're converting about 20 to 30,000 indigenous people. And the reason the Spanish are sending these friars as opposed to soldiers has to do with those numbers, right? I said there's very small number of Spaniards at this moment of time in St. Augustine. So people who are from Spain, people who are from Mexico and other parts of the Spanish America coming to Florida. We're in about the 1,000, 1,500 people in this period of time. That's it. 1,500 people, that's it, of the Spanish descent. So the vast majority of this world is in fact indigenous. So the Spanish have to be very careful about how they move through it because they don't have enough resources. So they think the Franciscans are the way to go to pacify and create an expansive system there. That all really changes in 1670 when the English are able to establish their first permanent settlement this farther south in the Americas. That would be Charleston, South Carolina. The English come in with just much more population. By the 1700s, you have a hugely much larger population in Charleston. You have about 7,000 people in Charleston. I said 1,500 for St. Augustine, 7,000 in Charleston by 1700, with half of those people being enslaved Africans. So you have a very different population that's coming to the region to trade, to expand. It's not there to missionize. And that really puts tremendous amount of pressure on the Florida missions that are there. It creates a cycle of slave raiding, and the English are very willing to trade guns with indigenous people, and indigenous people have to repay those guns with the sale of other people. So a whole system of Indian slaving and raiding takes place. I know I'm covering a lot of ground. The point is not to remember all of it, but to note this points here, that you have these big slaving raids that destabilize the region until you get these massive attacks, including an attack in St. Augustine in 1702. So this is the kind of chronology, and that I went through kind of fast and just to hit some highlights. This is the kind of chronology that appears in textbooks. And I purposely picked these dates and these events because they're all European. The Spanish come, the English attack, the Spanish mission spread, the English set up South Carolina, the English encourage Indian slaving, the English attack St. Augustine. And this is how often this history of the early South, and especially of Florida, if it ever appears, it appears like this, in this chronology that's all European led and based. And in a way, it makes sense, right? Because we know these events, we have it in our heads. If we know any, and we have any frame of reference, you know, these events are some of them. So it makes sense to organize it that way. Just very quickly to get back to you in the chat, Is there anything that, are these events relatively familiar? I know maybe not all of them are, but when I listed this events, were you all reading this slide going, yeah, I guess I know about most of these events, or were they all new? New to me, some familiar, most familiar for the most part, some new, some familiar, most fourth grade this week. Yay. Okay. That's exactly not as much as the slaving grade, but some of it new, some of it familiar. Okay. So here's the tricky part of this story. That, well, for some of you it's familiar, and for some of you this is new. This is still all European, and we're still not getting to the indigenous part. So the conversation and the trick is, how do we do this? If I told you there's such few little Europeans and such large numbers of indigenous people, how do we really think about these? So I'm going to begin with those stories. How do we begin thinking about these native worlds, and in fact, native majorities, and like really try to wrap your head around that. And that's something to communicate to your students over and over again, that the majority of people who are in this space are indigenous. They're not European. So perhaps this is one of my favorite stories because it's one Florida likes to tell a lot about itself. And that's the story of Ponce de Leon. Ponce de Leon, who is maybe coming to Florida for the Fountain of Youth. No, he's not. I'm sorry. He's really not coming for the Fountain of Youth, but he's there. He's exploring Florida. And as soon as he gets, he doesn't find the Fountain of Youth, but he does find the Calusa people. And as soon as he tries to make landfall in this part of Florida, he can't. He is completely pushed back and repelled, and he sort of writes back and he says he's encountered some hostile people. We can't make inroads there. These people are not to be dealt, you know, they're just fearsome, and the Spanish cannot deal with them. And, you know, historians and scholars repeat that story. They say, oh, Ponce de Leon tries to land, but he couldn't. And that's what made me pause and say, okay, how about we try to frame that story from the other side? Why is it not that Ponce de Leon can't make landfall, not from his point of view, but why is it that Calusa Indians repel him? Why is it that they shoot, that they fire, that they don't let him make landfall? So when we ask it like that, we can begin thinking about other potential answers. So it turns out in this case that Calusa people had informers. Calusa people are avid sailors, and they have connections all over the Caribbean. So a lot of them have been trading with Taino people, have been trading with people in what is now Hispaniola. And actually, some people within Calusa settlements speak some Spanish, and they're telling them about what's happening in the Caribbean. So the Calusa people actually know a little bit more about the Spanish than the Spanish know about the Calusa people. So I think this is really a moment where you can think, who's encountering who, right? We think of Europeans and Native people meeting for the first times, but in reality, when Ponce de Leon tries to make landfall here and doesn't, it's not because he's a bad sailor or can't find a port. It's because Native people know about him and they repel him out. The Calusa's violent encounter with Ponce de Leon happens in 1513. 1513. This is so early in the history of sort of European colonization into this world. Think of Columbus in 1492. 1513 is before Cortez goes to Mexico City, before Tenochtitlan, before Pizarro goes into Peru. This is so early into the story, and yet it reminds us that indigenous people are part of the early exploring world, not just as people waiting to be discovered, right? They're not just sitting there waiting, I'm just waiting for Ponce de Leon to make landfall. No, they're in fact very much aware and informed of the world around them. So my first sort of point with this story, and the one that I'm coming to next, is that Native people are paying tremendous attention to this world. They're not just passive passerbyers in the story, they're very active participants. So this is one thing to constantly remind yourself as you hear these stories, and not to think of them, if we're truly thinking about early encounters, we need to think about two groups of people actually doing an action of encountering, both having like active verbs and not just one being the recipient of that. And the Calusa people here are definitely that. The other one is, I think, one of my favorite stories, just because it's so ingenious on the side. So this is a map from 1525 that shows how the Spanish understand this world. And I love this map because it shows you how, like, kind of, they understand the coastline of Florida and a little bit, but they really have no clue beyond, right? It's a sort of incomplete map. So maps like this and sources like this really show you that the Spanish in the 1520s are just beginning to create their knowledge of this world. They're just beginning to put things together. And that is also true for indigenous people. So just as the Spanish are encountering and mapping and trying to make sense, indigenous people are doing the same thing. So let me give you another story of just that. So you may or may not know the name Panfilo de Narvas, but he's the leader of the expedition who then is most remembered because one of the survivors of that expedition, Cabeza de Vaca, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, wrote this account, and this marvelous account where he spends 8 years wandering all the way from Florida to Texas to what is now Mexico before he is found. So Panfilo de Narvas expedition in 1529 is a disastrous. Everything that could possibly go wrong with this expedition goes wrong. But one of the small things that happens in this expedition is the capture of a man called Juan Ortiz. It would be an inconsequential incident. It's very early in the narrative. It's almost like it's like unimportant. Like so many other more catastrophe things are going to happen in this expedition that this one seems easy to miss. So it's very early in the expedition. The Spanish are trying to figure out this region. They're trying to reconnoiter it. And in fact, the expedition has separated. So the Spanish are trying to figure out where the other group of Spaniards are. They're they're spending for each other. And as the Spanish are separated, a native chief on the Florida coast named Usita, and I can probably type that in the chat. And his spelling of his name is sometimes with a Z, sometimes with a C, Usita, takes advantage of the fact that the Spanish are looking for each other, right? He realizes that the Spanish expedition has divided, and he's going to take that opportunity to sort of prey on their vulnerability. So what he does is he erects what looks like to be a cross, sort of 2 sticks put together, and a letter, what looks like to be a letter. And he puts it just very near the shore. So the Spanish expedition, one of the two who is looking for the other one, is sailing and sees what looks to them to be the most readily identifiable Christian symbol, a cross, with a piece of paper and writing. Clearly, this is a Spanish leaving a message for another Spanish. There's no way, right? They think an indigenous person could have thought of this. This is clearly the other expedition leaving a note for them, right? No cell phones, no DMs, no anything like that. So they have to leave these notes. So Juan Ortiz is ordered to sort of row out and try to, pull out these notes to figure out where the other party is. But as soon as he makes it near the shore, he's captured. Because of course, this is in fact not a cross and not a letter, but a ruse made up by Chief Usita to purposely attack and capture Spaniards. So this trap that happens in the 1520s reveals indigenous people's keen ability to understand what the Spanish want. In this case, it's like information about one another. And perhaps more interestingly, it doesn't just show that Native people are saying, oh, I bet they want to know about each other, that they're understanding how the Spanish communicate, right? That they replicate a cross, that they replicate the letters, that they replicate things that are so readily identifiable as Spanish. So Native people, not just Europeans, are paying attention to one another to try to learn, to try to take advantage of that situation. So I think this is what I want to, as we move away from sort of these early encounters and moments and more into the early colonial history of Florida, to think about the fact that Native people are very active engagers in this story, that they're in fact paying attention to what Europeans are doing and using that knowledge to their advantage. And I know that seems like a very basic thing that I'm trying to communicate, and I'm doing it over and over again, but to repeat that indigenous people have agency in their story, that they have thought and they have ingenuity and they have strategy, and that their actions are not just reactions to what the Spanish are doing. They're not just running away or attacking because the Spanish are attacking. They're formulating their own plans and their own understandings of this world based on their knowledge. And I think that's really important when we think about introducing indigenous people in the story, that they're not just additive voices. They're not just like, oh, this is the Spanish story into Florida, and look, here are some Native people, here are some enslaved people, here's some women in the corner, but you know where the story is leading. I think that really exciting part of history and what we can teach and think to our students is those elements of contingency and adding complications to the story and showing all the different voices that really matter. All right. So let me move into the colonial period, into other sort of stories and sources that give us insight into Indigenous presence. And that way we can talk a little bit more about sources to show and showcase to students. So the first one is just someone, I don't have their name. He just appears in the record as an informer. And I love this story. I love all these stories. I'm an easily enthusiastic person, but all these are sort of gems, I feel, of the archive. So this story comes to us from the 1580s. So if we go back to our chronology, our European chronology, this is after the Spanish have established St. Augustine, after they've established a permanent settlement in the region. Their numbers are really, really small. They don't have sort of a big presence still in the region, but you know, they're there permanently. They've began to establish missions along what is now the coastline of Georgia. But they have a very tenuous hold. The majority of what they have is St. Augustine, and every fort they try to set up expandively in the 1560s and 70s has kind of collapsed. So they're really just centered in St. Augustine. So here we are in 1580, and an Indigenous person, and he's unnamed in the records, which is not that surprising. And that's the other part to communicate, is that oftentimes telling these stories is hard because we don't have, right? We don't have, from the Spanish perspective, we don't have all the sources and all the detail that they should be. So this incident occurs in the 1580s. So, and then a Native person comes to the gates of St. Augustine and says that he is here to bring some really important news. And he uses that word, Spanish word, nuevas. And he says he has seen a French vessel. He's like, I've been staying watch, and I've been noticing this French vessel, you know, coming up and down. And the Spanish are so eager to know. They're very sure the French are coming back to attack them after the Spanish have have kicked out the French from the region a little bit earlier. They're very sure they're coming back and forth to attack. And so they want to know. They sort of sit down this person and say, hey, tell me everything you can about this French vessels. Tell me about the number of men that you could see on board the ship. Did the ship have any particular cannons? Do you know anything about the weaponry of the ship? And this person begins to answer, this Indigenous person begins to answer all their questions. And as he begins to answer all the questions, Spanish officials began to wonder, how is it that this man knows so much about the French? How is it that he knows exactly how many men are on board, exactly how, you know, how many leaders, how many weapons, how many stuff? And he readily, and I know he's male because it's a Spanish source, so the language is gendered, so it's very easy to know that the person speaking is male. He says that, oh, I'm telling you this very faithful relation because I was on board the ship. I was on the French vessel, and I've been conferring with them and trading with them, and that's how I got all my intel. And all of a sudden, the Spanish have a mini heart attack and say, what do you mean you've been consorting with the enemy? What did you say to them? What did you tell them about us? Did you say anything about the Spanish to the French? So all of a sudden, this Native person, who was supposed to be just a humble informer to them, becomes this incredible person that's able to play the Spanish and the French off each other. And he says, oh, don't worry. The Indian said that I told the French that there's no vessels in the fort, and that the people inside the garrison are all very sick. This is what he says. And this reply of the fact that this Native person said there's no vessels out in the port and there's sick people all over the fort really shocks the Spanish. They said, why did you say that? That's not entirely true. Yeah, we've had a kind of difficult summer. There's been a little bit of illness, but it hasn't been terrible. And in fact, you do see that there's ships off the harbor. Why would you lie to the French? Why would you lie about this? And the native person basically replies and says, look, I figured that if I encourage the French, if I convince the French that the Spanish are really weak, they'll attack. But since they only have one ship and you guys have two, you'll be able to take the French. You'll be able to take it. And then you can divide the goods that are on board the French ship. And we would be able to, have more bounty, more goods at our disposal. And this is sort of an incredible moment. The Spanish don't agree to this tactic. They refuse to sort of to go after the French ship and attack it. But you see how an indigenous person is trying to manipulate the Spanish and the French off each other. And this is 1580. This is 1580. We're talking 15 years after the Spanish are able to permanently situate themselves in this region. Right. So if that story is one that I, as a historian, reading a lot of documents and terrible handwriting, was able to piece out and tease out, I wanted to share another story that's perhaps more readily available in documents that are in fact not hidden in an archive, but in fact in documents that are really that published are out there, but they're also quirky for a variety of reasons, and there's a lot of reasons why we don't use them. So the next story I want to tell you, if my point is this, Native people are paying really close attention to the colonial world, and they're trying to use it to their advantage, right? They're paying close attention, and they're doing a lot with that knowledge. So if that story is of an unnamed Native person, the next story I want to tell you is someone whose name I do know, and his name is Chief Manuel of Asile. And I'll write his name, Chief Manuel. And I know it's a Spanish name, and Asile is the town where he's from. So to tell you the story of Chief Manuel, I want to remind you again that these are the Spanish missions that are in Florida. The blue ones are Jesuits. They're very short-lived. The majority of them are Franciscan. And they, like I said, begin to establish in the 1580s and really pick up in the 1600s, 1650. And again, there's a lot of them. And the majority of people who live in them are indigenous. So you have one or two Franciscans surrounded by a lot of Native people. So when you think of these missions, I always tell my students, like, what do you think missions look like? And here in California, we think of the standard, rock, Hollywood stylized mission. And when you go to Florida, if you're in Tallahassee, you think of the beautiful existing current church in Mission San Luis in Tallahassee. But that's not what the churches or missions look like at the time. Remember, there's no rock in Florida. All these missions just look like Native huts, Native towns, right? This is circular structures, and the only thing they might have had different is maybe they had a cross outside. So these are really Native spaces in which Catholicism is being practiced and taught. So since the goal of these missions is to evangelize, to missionize, a big part of this early Spanish push is to do so in indigenous language. So there's a handful of Franciscans that really work with the Timucua language that's spoken in the vast part of this region in Florida, and sort of the north and west of Florida, Jacksonville area, and the like. So the Timucua language is instrumental to missionizing, and in fact, some of the earliest texts produced in what is, they were published in Mexico, but they were about the United States, come from Florida. In fact, Timucua is the oldest recorded indigenous language north of Mexico, and it has a bigger catechism than Wampanoag, right? So a bigger lexicon that we have for it. So it's a really important language when we think about the indigenous language of what is now the United States. Timucua is one of those languages. So they produced a lot of catechisms and the like. And one of the works that I have done, and I can talk in details, learning and working to learn this language and reading these texts. But these texts are all available. They're all digitized online, and they give you sort of the efforts to catechize in the language. But it's not just Europeans that are learning the tools of reading and writing. Indigenous people are doing that as well. And this brings me to my story. This image that I have is a letter. It's often called the Jesus Maria letter because those words are written at the very top. You see the words Jesus Maria. And it's a letter written not in just terrible hand that you have a hard time reading it, but even if you look at the very first words, if you can read that, it says Anano Kodo, and you're going, I don't know if this is Spanish. It's not. This is a letter written in Timucua, and written in Timucua by Chief Manuel of Asile. So this is the oldest letter that exists written by a Native person in a Native language in what is now the United States, and that comes to us from Florida. that comes from us from Timucua people, and that comes from us from this moment of time. It's a really important document, and it shows our students, it shows all of us that Native people are engaging with writing and epistolary, fancy word for letter writing and exchange in order to have conversations with each other and with the crown. So the story of literacy here is incredibly powerful. Timucua doesn't have a written alphabet until sort of Franciscan missionaries arrive in the late 16th century, but the alphabetic writing and tradition picks up. Franciscans complain all the time that Native people are using their newfound skill of reading and writing to communicate with each other in Timucua and not to sort of practice the Catholic faith. And they're very, very upset about this. And this letter that's written in 1651 writes about, it's a petition. And a petition is a very standard format in Latin America in which Native people petition, in particular, the crown or an authority for something. It's a sort of follows a certain protocol in which you sort of explain you're a loyal subject, you've done things right, and now you're asking for certain rights. And I see a question about the Timucua language, and I can talk at length about it because this is my project that I've done over the past year and a half to both learn this language that is not and working with descendants and ancestral communities to learn and think about this language. The language is not is alive in many interesting forms, and we're really excited to get more people to think and engage with it, especially because we have so many sources available for it to think critically about it. So what this letter that Don Manuel writes is not different. He's making a lot of claims in which he's sort of trying to argue with the Spanish about certain things that have not gone right. Some promises the Spanish made. Some of them are very practical. Like he says, look, the Spanish promised us they were going to give us axes. They were going to give us hoes. They didn't do that. They promised they were going to give us clothes, and they didn't do that. And look, and now we're mad, and we want to sort of write about all the promises that were given and not uttered. But in this letter is not just a petition explaining how good the Timucua are. It's also claims and articulations of Timucua identity and beliefs. And one of the most extraordinary things that happens, actually, I'm be happy to give more Timucua materials on language. It's because a lot of our sources were used without credit. We had to like write that person back and say, please cite us. But the Timucua language, no, everything and anything you can interact with this language. It's just amazing. So I want to talk in particular about Don Manuel. So Don Manuel is writing this letter in part because he's very upset about Spanish authority, but he has to tread very carefully, right? He's writing to an authority figure, just like when you're writing to your principals, to your superiors, you have to be very careful how you cushion those emails with some nice caveat. And Don Manuel is doing that. He's very careful about how he positions himself, the language he uses, and how he addresses that. Nonetheless, there's a clear articulation of Timucua wants and desires. And that comes in this moment in the middle of the letter where he says clearly, and at the root of this letter is sort of the Spanish not fulfilling the promises and claiming Timucua land that is not theirs. And the Spanish said, oh, you sold us the land. And Don Manuel explains Timucua people don't sell land. This is not how it works. And he says, even if I could give you the land, which I can't because land ownership doesn't work this way, and you know that, I will not give you the land. So I just thought, indulge me if you can for just a minute. I would show you what the Timucua actually says. And I color-coded. I know it's really crazy color-coded, but I will show you what part of the Timucua then corresponds with the English, because the Timucua language works in all sorts of ways. But I wanted you at the very least to hear and have a sentence in Timucua. So the sentence he says is Utima ni kwachi hetila. Uti means land, or the land there. And the kwachi is give. The T there highlighted that I emphasized when I spoke means not, is a denial. And the la is a declarative that says yes, that affirms what I'm saying. So this sentence is a declarative sentence in the negative. It says, I will not give you the land. So it's an incredible letter that in 1655, Don Manuel is writing to the Spanish crown, sort of working very carefully, using a lot of careful, flowery language to butter the Spanish up. But at the end of it, when he gets to the meat of it, he makes it very clear that Timucuas will not just give up their land, that that's not sort of how it works. and that they would be resilient to it. And this source, this letter, I've done work on it and I have images of it and it's available online, but at the very least to show your students that Native people are writing. They are writers, they are authors. And they are very much using not just fighting strategies like the Calusa did, but rhetorical, intellectual strategies to write about. And I love that. And one of my funny stories about this letter is at the very end of the letter, he signs it and he signs Manuel Istala. And a lot of historians who looked at this letter go, oh, that's his first and not last name. Like he's Mr. Manuel Istala. And Istala is just Temuco for like, I have said this. So that's not his last name. That's just an affirmative of what he's trying to say. But I'm diverging here, because I want to tell you one more story of another person whose names I do know. So if the story I told you earlier is of an informer who's trying to play the English, the French of the Spanish by sort of misinforming, the next story I told you is about a letter and thinking about literacy and the fact that we think of literacy, especially with misgendization, as a tool to oppress, as a tool to indoctrinate, right? We think of these catechisms and these books that are coming from the Spanish to change indigenous culture. Here we have this letter and that same literacy used for resistance. So the 1651 letter is really an example of Temuco people, and let me go back to it, Temuco people adapting to the strategies of Spanish literacy for their own purpose. The careful and historical linguistic examination of this letter allows us to change, right, usual colonial narratives and to read anti-colonial resistance in them. All right, but I left perhaps my favorite story to the last. And I think this one I'm doing because I know when I put my chronology, some of the questions I knew inevitably were going to be about Indian slavery. And since that's a topic not everyone is familiar with, I thought I could give you one story. And if that's a source of conversation, I'd be sort of delighted to try to answer that in the Q&A. So like I said, Charleston, South Carolina is founded in 1670. One of the key things that the English begin to do is trading with indigenous people for guns. So they trade Native people guns and they say, in order to pay me back for that gun, you need to return that payment with a slave. And I make the point that this was not a hidden thing. This was not a taboo. This Act for the Better Regulation of the Indian Trade is, you can readily find it online. It's part of the South Carolina early laws. So this system of Indian slavery is very, very well understood at the time as a way South Carolina is going to grow and accrue power in the region. So here in this, again, this wonderful map by John Worth, you can see that these trades, right, that these raids by indigenous people to pay back the English for their guns led to the enslavement of people all over Spanish Florida. And when I first saw this arrow going all the way down to Calusa, I thought, no way, no one is going, oh, I know how big Florida is. No one's going all the way from South Carolina to Florida to enslave people. And I've seen now substantial evidence to prove these lines absolutely right. So this is a very devastating moment. And as very early as 1670, when the English set up Charleston, you begin to see raids of people with guns enslaving and targeting Spanish Indians in Florida. Indians have been in the Spanish missions who are not armed. The Spanish did not arm indigenous people. They refused to do so, even as these raids were incremental. And it's here that I get to tell you the story of this one Native woman, and her name is Pamini. This is not her. I don't have a depiction of a Native woman from this moment of time. This is from much earlier, but I wanted to at least wrap our heads and visualize on this. So this is 1670. This is the coast here. And the Spanish are they know that European as English are attacking and invading and taking their Indian allies and enslaving them. So the Spanish are trying to figure out what is going on in this region. And this guy called Captain Arguelles is desperately trying to find Native people who can report and tell him what is going on in Charleston, what is going on in the English world. And it's at this moment that this man is not receiving a lot of support from indigenous people. No one wants to sort of report with him. No one likes to tell him anything. And at this moment, this woman comes up to him. And she introduces herself. I just love this. She introduces herself as the Cacica Pamini, the Cacica meaning, so the Spanish word, the Taino word cacique, meaning chief, and the Spanish Spanishize it. They add the A in the feminine to make her a female chief. So the Cacica Pamini comes and she says to him, and I love this, she comes up to him and says, I am not here to help you. Oh, so badass, right? She comes and she says, absolutely, I'm not here to help you. But let me just tell you. So he is immediately impressed with her. He thinks she's a powerful person who has control over the area, who doesn't need Spanish support, but she is going to help be his eyes and ears in the region. And here you can see the parts I've just highlighted in the source, that she's going to sort of spy on San Jorge, which is a Spanish name for Charleston. And here we're talking about dicha cacica, or so said the aforementioned cacica, or female chief. She's the cacica of Ispo. I used to call them ungoogleable because nothing would come up. Now, if you Google the Ispo, I think I come up. But they're a coastal group on the border sort of Georgia, right underneath Port Royal here. And she says, I can be your eyes and ears into Port Royal and Charleston. And he's able to, and I'm able to tell you, sort of give you information about them. What she doesn't tell Arguelles is that she has also gone to Charleston and offered the same kind of deal. That she said to the Charleston, I can provide you information about the Spanish. I can keep you appraised of what they are doing. So for about 2 years, from about 1670 to 1672, she's a double agent. She informs both the English about the Spanish, and she turns around and informs the Spanish about the English. And that might seem like a not too much of a significant story, but if you go back to this image of these raids that are just decimating the region, the fact that for 2 years she's able to maintain her people intact, her community intact, and she's able to do that by playing the English off the Spanish, it's a sort of incredibly resourceful and incredible of her that she's able to pull this together. And it's not very clear exactly when the English realized that Pamini is not exactly an informer just to them, but they turn on her, they enslave her family. She is not able to rally a response and get them back. So she tries to rally the only other card she has left to play. She goes to the Spanish and sort of says, I think the English are planning an attack. I think you have to go raid them. And you really sense sort of a desperation in her voice to get her family, but sort of the importance at the end of the day, she's not just playing the English of the Spanish because she can, she's playing them to protect her family, right? And that's the point from Don Manuel's letter too. He's writing this, not just to spite the Spanish, but to preserve their land, to preserve their autonomy, to preserve who they are. And I think that's the other point, is this agency is not just agency for agency's sake, it's for humanity, it's for survival, it's for their ability to retain a space in their own world. The story ends kind of poorly for her. A group of Chiluki Indians, they are highlighted, turn on her and basically say, look, tell that she has been talking with the English and that she has been encouraging war on them. And the Spanish say, yeah, we kind of had a feeling her intel was not so fresh, and we know she's, she was lying to us, and we don't think the English are really coming. She makes another appeal saying, no, I really think they're coming. I really think you need to go attack, but the Spanish don't take her seriously. And after that moment, she just disappears completely from the record. And it's really, really hard to find her anywhere. And it's a sad ending, but it reminds us of all the incredible strategies Indigenous people, from writing letters to resisting to playing informers of each other, that they are developing to come up with ways to fight and interact with one another. And it's important. And I have another story, but I feel like I'm running a long time on this other story. It's even more complicated, but it's also about an Indigenous woman. But I think these stories only appear to us in the sources as sad stories, right? Malena's story appears to us, like you read in the article, or the storyteller, as a moment of loss. Indigenous people often enter the archives to remind us that they didn't get something. But it's important to pause and think, I'm only seeing these moments when Native people lose. That means that for years before, they were winning, right? So when we read Pamini's story or we hear about her, we can think about the one moment she disappears from the archive and we never hear about her again. But we can think about all the times before, right, where she's succeeding and winning. And it's in telling that colonial archives don't like to tell us these moments where Native people are winning. They like to tell us these moments where they can suppress and control Indigenous people. But we have to then wade through them and think about what else is there? How else can we reframe the story so we can think about Native people not just appearing at moments of disappearance, but appearing at moments that really matter. And again, really thinking of them as active. So maybe I know I have like 50 minutes, but if you'll indulge me with my last story, it's about seeing Native futures and possibilities. And this one, again, is of an Indigenous woman that enters the archive at a moment where she's imprisoned. And she has a phenomenal story. And she comes to St. Augustine. Her name is Maria Jacoba. And she comes to St. Augustine next to someone who they know is a murderer, who has committed multiple crimes. So he readily confesses to all his crimes. It's an incredible moment in the story. And more is known about him, and his name is Kalesa. But this woman who's by his side, we know less about her. And this woman comes next to us in the year 1678, my last story, 1678. She comes to St. Augustine with this man, and the Spanish say, here you are in chains because you're with this known murderer. And she says, excuse me, I'm the reason you were able to capture this man. I encountered him along the way, and I was able to direct him to, I convinced him to go to this town where I knew there was a Spanish official who apprehended him. And that's why he's here, because of me. Like, you have me in chains. You should be thanking me for helping you capture this fugitive. And the Spanish are like taken aback by her testimony. And instead of sort of congratulating her, they're of course really taken aback that this Native woman knows more about them and about their world than this. And there's a lot about her story that's really, really interesting. And I want to just dwell on two things. One of them on the fact of her name. She's known in the record, and she self-identifies as Maria Jacoba. That's a Spanish name. She's baptized. I don't know if she's fluent in Spanish, but she definitely speaks Spanish. Her life was really different than her mom or her grandmother, because she's very much integrated into this colonial world and inhabits all the spaces. But the other thing is who she says, where she says she's from. The Spanish say, okay, you're Maria Jacoba. And they say, which town are you from? And she says, oh, I'm from the town of Santa Ana. And the cacica, the chiefess, the woman chief who's my leader, is Maria Melendez. And this leaves the Spanish in a shock, because they said, I thought that town was gone. There's no town. Basically, there's no town of Santa Ana. There's no cacica of Maria Melendez. But the Spanish are wrong. So this is this moment where, in her own name and in her own self-identification, we see all the possibilities that are available. She inhabits the Spanish colonial world. Her name is Maria Jacoba, but she also inhabits all these spaces that the Spanish don't quite control. And because Spanish sources only make women like Maria Jacoba visible only at the very end, only at moments where they're in jail or in chains, we don't get to see all the creativity and spaces. So it's very, that they create for themselves. So it's very important when we're thinking about Native people and Native sources to think about how we can foreground their voices and their story and give them agency and a way to articulate their own desires, their own wants into this. And I'll stop right there. Thank you so much. I don't know if I can open it up for questions now, if this would be a good time for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You gave us so much to think about, and just different ways to think of our own communities. Many of the people here tonight are living in Florida. So I am excited to read your new book, which is coming out in May. Is that still the release date?
Yes, that's still the release date from.
Okay. Great. And it is talking back Native women and the making of the early South. So I'm sure if you enjoyed these stories, you can read about many more Native women and their stories as well. So we'd love to take some questions. You have a fan club. People are asking where we can follow you.
I was on Twitter, but Twitter kind of imploded. So I'm not as active on Twitter as I was before, but I answer any emails and any, I think you have access to my PowerPoint, or they can be made available. I'd be happy to share the link for the PowerPoint and the like, but any resources that I can provide and the like. I'll just put up, since I was poo-pooing a good blog post, I shouldn't have been so cool. This is a site where that I'm helping develop about creating Timucua lessons. So you could think about how to read and how to think about Timucua sources. And along the same lines, here's a Timucua dictionary. It's incomplete and it's in the process of coming up, but it's absolutely there. So I see a question says, what first prompted me on my research? So my research on Indigenous women was really haphazard in the way of many of us who do this work. But I'll just say that I was studying, I really think deeply about I really like wars, and I thought I was going to write a book about war and sieges and nothing to do with women. And I stumbled on this really long petition by a Spanish woman. That's the last chapter of my new book. And it's very long. It's like 100 pages of this one woman's petition. And I thought, oh, I'm going to write a feminist story about a kick-ass Spanish woman. And she's awful. She is like my villain. She's the worst person you could think of. And as I was trying to piece her story together, I began to realize, right, this is not a Spanish story. This is there's so few Spanish that even if I wanted to tell a primarily Spanish story, I have to think about who else is there. And I think that very basic demography, when I think who is in Florida at this time, you begin to realize this is an indigenous space for a very, very long time. So if we want to tell the early history of Florida, and by early, I mean, through the 1800s. And so we're telling indigenous stories. And the question then begins, how to do that right? How to do that ethically? How to do that in ways that is responsive to the things we're finding in the archive, but also in conversations with ongoing discussions.
All right, great. Barbara asked, where do you do your primary source research primarily?
That's a great question. So a lot of the original sources are in what's called the AGI, or the Archivo, it's a horrible name, Archivo General de Indias, which is the General Archive of the Indies. If you ever want to know if the Spanish will think of the United States as colonial settings, they do. And in the AGI, or the Archivo General de Indias, it's organized geographically by the viceroyalties of the Spanish world. So the Spanish had hubs in Cuba and Santo Domingo and Peru and Mexico, and a lot of the materials from Cuba, from Florida after 1763, when Florida gets turned over to the British in 1763. So, the other history of Florida, right? The Florida Spanish up until 1763, when the Spanish joined the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War on the wrong side, on the side of the French. So they then lose Cuba, and the Spanish lose Cuba, and they realize, oh my God, we'll trade anything to get Cuba back, and they trade Florida. So at that moment where they're evacuating out of Florida in 1763, they remove their archives. So some of it goes to Cuba for a little bit, but the majority then gets shipped back to Spain. Some of it gets lost along the way, but those are colonial archives, right? So some of the everyday items we know are lost, but then a lot of my work was also done at the amazing University of Florida in Gainesville, at UF, at the P.K. Young Library. Honestly, it's one of the most incredible repositories of Florida history. And I've also done work in St. Augustine. Looking again, sometimes they have copies of the stuff that's in Spain, but they have, why not? They have, I get to be in that space and the like. So those are the main repositories of archival sources. Oh, I see a question from Heather. Do the French have similar archives in the region? So the French are in Florida from briefly in 1562, and then a little bit longer in 1564 until they're kicked out by the Spanish. Kicked out is a nice way of putting what happens to them in 1565. And the archival stuff from there is a little bit limited. There's some depositions, and there's the printed material that Laudonnière produces to sort of explain why it all goes so poorly in these French places. So there's some early archive, but I'm less familiar with it. I read the printed and I read some of the depositions, but not as, I didn't do like a deep dive on the French archive because they're in Florida for so little. But then there's also all the other evidence to think about. And that's all of you as you're walking around all these incredible spaces in Florida that still exist. Even, all these native names that are still there, all these archaeological sites that are being dug up. And those are sources as well that you can use and you can think through.
All right, great. There's another question in the chat that Mary Lee asks, and it's a really good one. She wants to know if the tribes were more maternal or paternal, because you mentioned both male and women chiefs. So did they see women as more equals or no?
So yeah, so the way we think about the matrilineal, that's the way we say matrilineal or patrilineal, and meaning the basic bare minimum meaning of that means that the line of succession either goes through the father or the mother side, right? So if you're in a matrilineal society and you are a male chief, it's not your son that's going to inherit. It's going to be the son of your sister, perhaps, right? So it goes through the women's side, not through the male line. And in a patrilineal society, it goes through the male line. But that doesn't mean in patrilineal societies that native patrilineal societies, it also doesn't mean that Native women have less of a role. We actually see much more egalitarian understanding of the gender roles. And by that, I mean, so the Southeast, the Timucua people that I've described, and every other group that I've mentioned today are matrilineal societies. And I would even go to venture that the Timucua are also matrifocal, which means that not only does the line of succession go through the female line, but when you marry, you go into your wife's house. You don't follow the man, right? So a lot of times when you're describing divorce or the like, you see men having to leave their house because it's not their house, it's their wife's house. They have possession of the physical space. And in the Southeast, you have a lot of female chiefs. In fact, it's more rare to have tribes that don't and nations that don't have female chiefs than ones that do. They play a critical role in council houses, in strategy and the like. So while it's weird for the Spanish, and the Spanish oftentimes say, are you sure you want a female? Like a lot of times in later stories in my book in the 1670s and the like, the Spanish are saying, well, your chief has died. Why don't you appoint this male heir as the chief? And the nation comes back and says, absolutely not. We want this woman. And the Spanish kind of go back and say, are you sure you want a woman chief? And they go, yeah, that's the way it works. And there's sort of no question. So this matrilineality, and I definitely make an argument for that in the book, is not just something that Native people practice, but it's something the Spanish have to recognize and deal with. And that means it's very, very powerful. It's not just a side thing or a fad or something like that. It's something intrinsic and inherent to how Native people organize their world. And it's so important that the Spanish just can't steamroll it, even if they want to, even if they don't want to deal with a Native woman chief, even if they rather go talk to a Native man, they have to interact with a woman.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. And the question was if you could talk more about De Vaca's relations with Magdalena during the time period.
The Soto relations with, I mean, so these stories are so frustrating because I felt like Scott Cave did everything you possibly can, and the rest is being left to our heads to try to fit the way we can. And I think we all want to know more, but what I would tell you is that European sources, especially the conquistadors, are often very quiet when it comes to women. And you can read them and pretend almost that, Cabeza de Vaca in particular, he marches through this land and you could almost believe that he does not encounter a single woman, because boy, does he not talk about them. But you have to remember that just because European sources don't mention women doesn't mean they're not there. That means they're not thinking they're important. That doesn't mean they're actually not important. And it's one of those things that a really famous ethnographer, Ina Clendenin, says, these conquistadors, these invaders, are not really good ethnographers, right? They're not very good at telling us what's up. They're very good at telling us their own biases and fears. So when you read De Soto, when you read Cabeza de Vaca, you have to think to yourself, oh, this is what a conquistador thinks, not what a Native person necessarily or at all thinks. So it's again trying to put them, and I say to my students in the most basic exercise that I urge you with your students is whenever we're summarizing a narrative or something, I'll ask my students, so tell me, what Native people did. And inevitably, they'll all write about Native people in the passive voice, like something happened to them. Their land was taken, their thing was happened. And I always say, can we rework that sentence to make Native people not be in the passive voice? How can we make Native people the subjects of their sentences? And I know that sounds very, very basic, like very basic grammar structures, but if you put Native people as the subjects, not as the objects who are receiving the violence, but in fact, part of the conversation, it really shifts the way students do that. And I do that with students, and we reworked even just their basic summaries. It helps them understand so much their unintentional biases when they were reading those stories.
All right, well, thank you so much. My head is swirling. I'll probably be researching myself until 1 a.m. Lots of new information and lots of great information to take a deeper dive into. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I hope you have a great evening, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of you soon. Have a great night.